Crowley, former Assistant Secretary of State for Public Affairs, a fellow at the George Washington University Institute for Public Diplomacy and Global Communication, and a member of the Aspen Homeland Security Group. When the forum schedule came out a few weeks ago, this was one panel I put a star next to and have been looking forward to ever since. A few years ago, on a trip to Taiwan, after meetings to review Taiwan's relationship with China and the growing commercial and personal ties between the island and the mainland, I suggested to the National Security Advisor of Taiwan at the time that this is a situation that would work itself out over the next 25 years. He agreed with me but said, the challenge is getting from here to there. When it comes to the Middle East, we may know what the region needs to do, move towards more effective governments, stronger institutions, progressive economies, and more tolerant and inclusive civil societies. But the trip is proving to be a lot harder than we expected. We may have GPS, but states, non-state actors, and even empowered publics are wrestling for control of the wheel. The destination may still be a better history for the Middle East or the right side of history, but over the last couple of decades, we seem to consistently end up in cul-de-sacs of competing histories and are forced to recalculate and start over. So what we are seeing at the moment, a series of crises that we are struggling to understand and have been forced on multiple occasions to rename, the Arab Spring, the Arab Awakening, the Arab uprisings, take your pick. It is certain that the Middle East and North Africa will remain the world's most complex and unpredictable region of the world and will clearly preoccupy political leaders in this country and elsewhere for the foreseeable future. We have a great panel of foreign policy experts to help us make sense of what is happening in the region today and perhaps the potential implications going forward. And the panel's navigator is Elise Labott, CNN's newly minted global affairs correspondent. And I'm really pleased in a reversal of roles that I get to introduce Elise rather than being grilled by Elise. Elise, over to you.
Thank you, PJ. Thank you, and thank you once again to Clark and the Aspen Security Forum. PJ set the scene for us, and we have so much ground to continue, so I'm not going to start with any introduction remarks. We have really, I can't think of three more thoughtful people to talk about these complex issues with me today. We have Ambassador Mohamed Tawfik, Ambassador of Egypt to the United States, Ambassador Robert Ford, the former ambassador of the U.S. to Syria, and now a senior fellow at the Middle East Institute, and Ambassador Dennis Ross. There are so many titles next to his name, and he's really handled pretty much every conflict that we're going to be talking about today. Formal assistant to the president and senior director for the Central Region for the National Security Council. We know him, of course, as a longstanding U.S. peace envoy, and now he is the distinguished fellow and counselor at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. And happy to be filling in for Margaret Brennan of CBS News, who's out on the road with Secretary Kerry as he tries to find a ceasefire in Gaza. Let's start off with the news of the day, Robert, in Libya. The U.S. Embassy, U.S. pulled out all of its staff under military protection. Tell me about what this message sends about this country really going to hell. You know, you've pulled out what we're not. Listen, we're not here to be diplomatic. We're here to talk about the tough issues. And now that we'll see how diplomatic the ambassador can be. But the two of you, I don't expect diplomaties. How are we going to affect political change? The U.S. says it's a temporary situation. But you know from having pulled out of Syria, when you pull out, you destroy documents, you destroy equipment, you are exiting the country. And how is the U.S. going to be able to affect change of what's going on in Libya from afar? What kind of message does this send? And what does this say about the fact that the U.S. helped the Libyans get rid of Muammar Gaddafi? But the criticism is that it never really had that hands-on political engagement to see the country develop. How do you move forward from that space?
The situation in Libya has been declining for months. The security situation has been degrading steadily, and thus the step that the embassy took to withdraw staff is simply a manifestation of how bad the security situation has become, and especially fighting between different tribal factions. And so I think the lesson goes back to something that people like John Negroponte were saying to the group yesterday, that it's very hard to do state building. Ultimately, it's going to be Libyans, not the American embassy, who have to rebuild their country. And although we can certainly give them a hand, it is a Libyan responsibility and it's a Libyan challenge. Without an embassy, it'll be harder for us to provide help, very frankly. And so I hope that the security situation will improve over the weeks and months ahead so that the embassy can go back in. It's much harder to engage when you're not on the ground with the people that you need to deal with.
Ambassador, let's talk about, Libya is a perfect example of the Arab Spring. You have this euphoria when you have the revolutions in Egypt. You had it in Libya, you've had it elsewhere. And after this euphoria, you've seen this period of instability. And I don't think we really know where this is headed. There's nothing that's emerged that tells us where we're going to end up. And a lot of people seem to think, well, that just shows that the democratic experience didn't work and we really need to return towards some kind of autocratic rule. Talk to us a little bit about that.
Well, first of all, I would disagree with the conclusion you referred to at the end. There is no doubt that the forces in the region that created what you refer to as the Arab Spring, I refer to as the Arab transformation or the Arab revolution, these forces are still there. These needs are still there. It is true that it's much easier to bring down a regime than to put in its place a better system. It's something that takes time, takes effort, and we're still in the beginning of the process. But having said that, we have to maintain the course. There are legitimate aspirations for the peoples in the Arab world and in many other parts of the world. And in the 21st century, these aspirations have to be met.
Dennis, why don't you speak a little bit about that? And also the fact that, look, a lot of these secular governments fell in this kind of wave of revolutions, but the monarchies remained. And what does that say? What lessons have we learned about which governments fell and which didn't? And does a government that has stability but not necessarily rights, how do you get the two at once?
Look, first I think we have to take a look at what's happened. I have rarely used the term Arab Spring because the spring implied we're going to have this rapid transformation. Just like in the spring you have a flower, it's there. We were going to go from a situation where, in the absence of a political culture that emphasized tolerance and respect for minority rights and institutions that were there to ensure that you could build a kind of respect for each other, we're going to go from having authoritarian realities to producing this democratic reality overnight, hence the spring. It was never going to be an Arab Spring. There was, you use the word transformation or revolution, I use the word awakening. You mentioned it in your introduction. There was an awakening. There was a greater appreciation because of social media, because of the internet, there was a greater appreciation of the way others lived and a desire to live that way as well. There was a youth bulge, there was a loss of fear. All these things came together and produced what amounted to this kind of explosion of political activity. Easier to have that kind of expression, but then you have to move from that to creating a new reality. The institutions for it weren't there. The organization for it wasn't there. The kind of transformation that you're calling for is at least a generational project. So now we're living with what is a kind of uncertainty, and we're also living with something else. We're living with what I would describe as a search for identity. You move from a period where you have authoritarian rule and it's replaced by a vacuum. And what do people fall back on? They fall back on what gives them the greatest sense of security. So you end up in different places with tribal identities or sectarian identities. That becomes the focal point around which you try to build. Well, that's going to take a long time to sort out. you raise the monarchies. So why didn't what we saw in the so-called republics, why haven't we seen that in the monarchies? Well, part of it is many of the monarchies at least had a semblance of built-in legitimacy. Here, we may not relate to dynastic rule, but there at least was a justification for why they were in power. Many of the monarchies, not all, also had resources, and they could spread those resources around to create at least a semblance of acceptance. Now, in the monarchies that didn't have that, in Morocco and in Jordan, nonetheless, they at least had some semblance of, I would say, legitimacy, and they also had something else to point to. The greater the upheaval elsewhere, the more that created a chilling effect. You look at Syria today, how many others in the region want to look like Syria? Or, for that matter, look at Libya today. How many other places want to say, gee, that's an example that we want? So you've had a kind of chilling effect in the places that haven't experienced this upheaval. It doesn't mean that basic yearning, basic aspirations aren't still going to come to the fore, but the fact is, now there's a process that's going to take a long time to play out.
Well, and it seems like, particularly in Syria, those yearnings, and even in many of these other countries, those yearnings are still there. And Robert, when we look at what's going on with ISIS right now, taking large swaths of Syria and Iraq, what does that do to the cause of the Syrian opposition? Because you have Ryan Crocker and Tom Pickering, very well-respected former diplomats, and others saying, shouldn't we be working with President Assad? The conventional wisdom is he's winning, and he's the lesser of all of these evils right now.
2 points I'd make. Number one, the moderate elements of the armed opposition are still there, and they still very much represent the people who organized the peaceful demonstrations in Syria in 2011. Those people are still in the fight, and they're making advances on the ground. I'm sort of appalled, frankly, by some of the press assessments which say that the moderate armed opposition is finished or it's gone. It's actually not, and if you just take the time to look at the battles across the country, you'd see that in many places they're advancing. They were making gains near central Damascus yesterday, for example. So the battle is not finished, but they absolutely do need help because they've been under attack from both the Islamic State and the regime for most of the past year. So that leads me then to the Islamic State itself, and it's had fabulous victories both in Syria and in Iraq. They captured US-made equipment and sent it back into Syria. The Islamic State actually finally attacked some regime positions. It's the first time they've done that in quite a while on a large scale in north central Syria earlier this week, and they captured an army base, a very serious army base, using in part American equipment. I kind of have to laugh at the constant worry that any equipment we give to these moderates who came out of a peaceful protest movement worried about it getting into the wrong hands, our stuff that we gave to the Iraqis is now being used against Syrians. So it is a time to sort of weigh costs and benefits on Syria. Helping moderate armed elements has risks. There is no question about that. But not doing anything also has risks. And this conference has spent days talking about the Islamic State. I don't need to go into it further. So, but the Syrian uprising, I don't really call it a revolution, I call it an uprising, is very much still underway. And
it's very much still underway, but it would be disingenuous to say that right now, whether it's the United States or any of these countries, are looking at it specifically within the demands of the Syrian people for freedom and that kind of. I mean, it does seem as if they're really put on the back burner right now.
Well, there's another element of this which is really important, which is that it started out as something between Syrians and their government, and it has transformed into both a nasty sectarian battle inside Syria and then a regional conflict pitting Shia elements against Sunni elements region-wide. Hezbollah, Iran on one side, Iraqi Shia on that side. People that we fought in Sadr City and in Basra are now fighting the same Syrian moderates I was just talking about. And on the other side, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, etc. So it's just metastasized in so many bad ways.
Mohamed, tell us about your experience in fighting with the jihadists in the Sinai. And I mean, these conflicts are local, but you have these sectarian agendas that are really kind of spreading throughout the whole region.
That's true. And as Dennis was saying, this issue is becoming an issue of identity. And when you talk about jihadists, when you talk about Islamists in general, they're not about religion. They're about identity. And that's where Egypt's value added comes in, because we are the country in the region that has this overwhelming historic national identity. And that's why the Islamists failed in Egypt. This is something that Egyptians are not willing to give up. We know who we are. We're a mixture of different things. We're a book full of different chapters. There's room in Egypt for Islamic culture, ancient Egyptian culture, Coptic culture. There are ancient synagogues in Egypt. This whole mixture has been fused together over thousands of years. And that's where we represent a sort of model for others. We do not want to see how many ways different societies can be divided. Because if you go down that road, we will discover that the ways of division are really infinite. It's not just about, I mean, why say it's Sunni versus Shia? Because also within the Shia you can have different divisions, and within the Sunnis you can have different divisions, and so on. And so this is basically why what happens in Egypt has a tremendous influence over the whole region. Now, in the Sinai, you mentioned the jihadis in the Sinai, and that's why they're fighting the battle there. They're fighting the battle because they understand that what happens in Egypt will ultimately affect the rest of the region. And Egypt is the only country in the region where the jihadis are effectively and decisively being defeated. And that's extremely significant.
Well, that has historically been true about Egypt, and I think that anybody that's been to Egypt or has studied it kind of knows about this great, Egyptian nationalism. But the ouster of President Morsi and the crackdown on the Muslim Brotherhood has really put into question whether people now are just Egyptian, or whether these type of, whether it's sectarian or ideological divides are throwing into question the future of Egypt. How does President al-Sisi, after this massive crackdown of the Muslim Brotherhood, maybe you could talk to us a little bit about these death sentences, still, even though it started at like 1,200, I understand maybe there are 200 still on death row. How does he reconcile the country and once again have Egyptians believe that it's about Egyptian nationalism and not the secularists versus the Islamists?
Well, first of all, there's nobody on death row in Egypt. There are people who have been convicted in courts of first instance, and the public prosecutor has himself appealed. So there's still a lengthy legal process that's going to take place.
You don't think they'll be put to death?
Well, some of them will. I mean, let me tell you some of the crimes that these people are accused of. Basically, they're accused of attacking police stations, killing the police officers, dragging their bodies through the streets, taking hold of the weapons, attacking other stations, attacking churches, burning down churches, controlling whole districts for days, during which massacres took place. This is what they're accused of having done. And all this happened in public. All this is filmed. There were television crews filming, and these things happened. So eventually, I'm sure that some people will be found guilty. But that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about process. And what I can guarantee is that due process will take place.
Talk about the reconciliation piece, though.
OK. Now, the issue of identity, again, is this about ideology? Well, you can't say it's about ideology in the sense that some Islamist parties were part of the coalition that removed Morsi from office. So what you can say is that a large percentage of Egyptians, a majority, a clear majority, reached a conclusion that we were moving in the wrong direction, that if we had continued down that path, we would have been in trouble, and that we need to concentrate on rebuilding the country, and there will always be a place for everyone in our country, provided they respect the law. So this is what we're looking at. We still have parliamentary elections coming up. What I can tell you about that is that anyone is free to run in these elections.
Not
the
Muslim
government,
Brotherhood, though.
Let me just finish. The government does not have the authority to prevent any party from running. It is the courts that have that authority. And these parties, they can fight it in the courts. And it's not going to be the government who makes the decisions. It's going to be the judiciary. And we're going to wait and see how the process proceeds. But if you look, you mentioned President Sisi. If you look what President Sisi has done in the last 30 days, he has introduced more economic reform measures that have than what was introduced in the preceding 30 years. So it's clear what the approach is. The approach is to create jobs, is to deal with the problems people are facing, is to try and lift parts of the population out of their poverty. And this is basically what the majority of Egyptians want.
We got to divert it a little bit. Dennis, I want to go back to Iraq for a minute. You know, these... I
may still comment on some of this, but go ahead.
Please do. We were talking about the fact that these conflicts are local.
Yeah.
And now you have, but there are these regional sectarian agendas and at stake, and it not only that, but the idea of, you know, ISIS and trying to put a caliphate together, you know, is questioning the borders that were drawn by colonial powers all these years ago. If we left the Arabs to their own devices, do you think they would be redrawing these borders? Or do you think that they would go back to, you know, in Iraq, for instance, are we looking at some kind of federalism? And how does that affect the rest of the region?
Well, there's what I would describe as the de facto reality, and then there's the legal reality. In Iraq today, there isn't a unified Iraq, and there's not going to be a unified Iraq for a long time to come. Do you try to formally recognize that? I think the more you do that, the more you guarantee an enduring conflict. I'd be very careful about having anybody on the outside say, gee, let's go redraw the borders now. Let's not have a new version of Sykes-Picot. That can't be what goes on now. I would like to take a step back, though, and pick up on some of the things that have been said. There is a larger struggle going on. In a lot of ways, Syria is a microcosm of it, because on the one hand, Syria is a proxy war between Saudi Arabia and Iran. And it's also a sectarian war over the future of identity, which, by the way, Bashar al-Assad produced. This was a set of peaceful demonstrations. He had to turn it into a sectarian conflict because it was the only way he could survive. So we have a sectarian conflict there that the regime produced. We have a proxy war that is playing out over the competition between Saudi Arabia and Iran. And then in the region, we have something else going on that is in part what's going on in Egypt, and that Saudi Arabia also feels, which is a struggle between, in general, the Islamists and the non-Islamists. It's true what's going on in Egypt. You want to create what is a state now that is still going to be basically secular, that reflects its historic Islamic traditions. But it isn't going to be an Islamic identity that defines everything and that has no sense of national identity. What Mohamed was getting at in one respect, I think, is important not to lose sight of. One of the reasons the Muslim Brotherhood alienated a majority of Egyptians is because they were Islamists first and not Egyptians first. Just like today, Hamas is an Islamist group first, not Palestinians first. If you get away from a national identity, then you're going to foster these kinds of conflicts. You raised the question about Iraq. We have Maliki acting as a sectarian leader, not as a national leader. He had every opportunity. In a sense, what the United States provided him was the ability to create the potential for a new Iraqi state.
But
he
when
is the one.
it became apparent that he wasn't doing that, I mean, the U.S., he did do this for quite a long time, though.
Look, the key...
Did you give him too long of a leash to...
Well, I mean, look, you can ask the question. Robert was there, so he can actually... He's a better one.
Too.
Yeah, but he was actually on the ground over there. I was in Washington. And the fact is, I think we knew who Maliki was for a long time. There were judgments made about what could be done with him. There was a sense that he had more of a potential to put together a government in 2010. He made a series of promises at the time about how he would share power. He respected none of the promises that he made. And you could ask the question, in the end, could we have done more? I don't know. I mean, it's an open question. We could probably debate it for a long time. What's clear is that he had an opportunity to build a state, and he squandered it.
Robert, how do we not repeat the same mistakes in Iraq? And if we could have done more to make sure that Maliki was more inclusive, how do we avoid this next time?
A couple of things that leap to my mind. First, I don't think we should be in the business of picking winners, and to be honest, in 2010 we did. So let's give the Iraqis time to hash this out. Frankly, haste makes waste is a saying in both English and Arabic, and there's a bit of haste on the American side to, the Iraqis, you've got to finish, so we can get back to negotiating other stuff. Even though the Islamic State is, moving around in parts of northern and western Iraq, in Baghdad, if there's any hope of maintaining a central government with any hope of functioning, they're going to have to hash out not just the prime minister, they're also going to have to hash out different ministries, probably even some of the sub-ministerial posts, and they're going to have a game plan for how they're going to work together. The things that Dennis was talking about, which Maliki promised, but which didn't materialize, and within a year, we were already hearing static. So I can't, personally, I would be very surprised if the Iraqis worked that out in a matter of weeks. It would be much better than they did in 2005 or 6 or 10. I think there's a need for some patience to let them work through these things. One little bright note, they did choose a parliament speaker relatively quickly, Salim Djibouti, who is, interestingly enough, from the Muslim Brotherhood. He's a lawyer, very sharp young man. And they chose a new president, Fouad Massoum, who has long experience in the Iraqi parliament. In fact, he was the leader of the Iraqi parliament back in 2005 and 6. Very close to Kurdish circles around Jalal Talabani. So maybe they're going to go faster. Maybe with time, they're learning how to negotiate more quickly. That's what I would hope. But the most important thing is don't rush the Iraqis into a bad deal.
We're rushing them because we think that this is what's going to be the thing that's going to get ISIS.
But this is what I'm saying, is the whole reason we have the ISIS problem to begin with is because what was agreed to in 2010 was not sustainable.
One other point, though. We're not mentioning Iran and the role they played then and the role they play now. And the fact is they've made their own set of misjudgments in terms of putting all their bets on Maliki. We made some judgments at the time, too, which I think the two of us were not huge enthusiasts over. But the fact is, we did. But you shouldn't underestimate the role that the Iranians play in determining how the politics there are going to unfold. And if they continue to play it a certain way, it's going to have its own set of consequences.
Can I jump in?
Yes, but we've only gone through, I think 1/3 of the conflicts.
I just want to say, I think Dennis is right, but I mean, Qasem Soleimani, the head of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, is a really capable opponent. And the Iranians, I think, have a marvelous ability to have good relations with a whole series of competing political actors. Right. To me, Iranian political strategy is not so different from Iranian carpets. They can use a lot of very different colors, weave them together, and come up with fabulous designs.
On that note,
the Americans are sort of black and white. Our carpets are never as good.
I'm still waiting to see the Iranians weave those carpets there.
On that point, Mohamed, and then I really want to move on to the Israeli-Palestinian issue. There's all this talk about a nuclear deal and whether, I want to get to that too, but let's say we get a nuclear deal with Iran. Is that indicative that Iran wants to rejoin the family of Arab and regional nations and become more of a constructive actor in the region? And do you see that ever possible? Or is this just a way to end sanctions and continue to sow discontent, whether it be in Iraq or Libya or Syria or the Palestinian conflict?
I think when we're talking about Iran, there are three different issues. The first issue is the non-proliferation issue. And our position is very clear. We do not want nuclear weapons or weapons of mass destruction in our region. We don't think they're useful. We think they're extremely harmful. And they start of all kinds of races. And nobody is going to benefit from them. So this is something that we have a very clear position on. But there's another issue regarding Iran, and that is the kinds of alliances it has and the kinds of groups it supports. And again, this is an important issue. And for Iran to have good relations with its Arab neighbors, it needs to do something about that. But then there's a third point that we have to talk about. And that is if we look at the balance of power between Arab countries and the non-Arab countries in the Middle East, you'll find that right now there's a deficit on the side of the Arabs. And these things will not work themselves out perfectly unless and until you have a new balance in which the Arabs have a sense of purpose together and in which they can bring together all the elements of power that they own. And we're already starting to see in the relations between Egypt and some of the Arab countries and how close these relations are coming and the level of cooperation that's being produced, that this will be an important element in what the Middle East will look like in the future.
Well, just to follow up quickly on that point, one of the reasons that Egypt is close to Qatar and Saudi Arabia and UAE is because they see, the Islamist movement and the threat by Iran differently.
I wouldn't include Qatar in that.
Well, I meant all the Gulf nations.
I would say the Saudis, the Emiratis, absolutely.
Well, but can Iran be part of this equation and join this, improving this deficit?
Well, if you pick up what Mohamed was saying, implicit in that is only if they change their behavior. I mean,
well, do they want to? Is this nuclear deal indicative of the fact that they want to get back to the international community or just end the sanctions?
I see it more in the latter form because I don't see them changing any of their other behavior. Why do we still see them sending clandestine arms shipments to the Houthis in Yemen? Look at what they're doing in Syria. I mean, all of the Shia militias in Iraq are now fighting ISIS, but you had Hezbollah in Syria. If you look at the Saudi perspective, looks at Iran right now through a particular lens. They don't look at the nuclear issue the way the Israelis look at the nuclear issue. The Israelis look at the nuclear issue as an existential question. The Saudis look at what they see the Iranians doing in Bahrain, in the Eastern Province, in Iraq, in Syria, and Yemen as an existential challenge. They see them trying to surround them. They look at a nuclear deal as a threat to them because they see it freeing Iran to get away from the sanctions, to be economically much more powerful, gives them much more means for troublemaking throughout the region. And so the key to your question is Iran prepared, if it does a nuclear deal, to become a more normal state in the region, or do they see the nuclear deal as something that gives them greater freedom to seek what is their objective in the region, which is a kind of hegemony? They think they have a right to dominance in the region. And that certainly is the perception of many of their neighbors. I think one of the reasons that there's a perception of us that we are not, in a sense, competing the way we should is because we are seen as not competing with the Iranians and dealing with this balance of power question more generally within the region.
We're going to move to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and we had an interesting discussion earlier. Why do you think that there's a perception that the U.S. doesn't have as much influence in the region?
Well, part of it is absolutely what Dennis said. I think there's a huge frustration among especially the Gulf states that we do not challenge the Iranians more aggressively. I think that's absolutely true. It's not a secret that at one point the King of Saudi Arabia was urging us to strike Iran militarily. So there's a frustration there. But what we were talking about over coffee this morning is that a second reason I think that we have lost some influence and leverage in the region is that there is a growing perception from my contacts over there that the Americans are no longer able to deliver Israel on a peace deal. and that more and more they're going to have to figure out some other way, some other strategy to deal with Israel. It's not to say they're giving up on the peace process, far from it, but I think their expectations from us are lower, and that in turn reduces our leverage with them because they don't think we're really credible on the issue.
Mohamed, the Israeli position is fairly clear. They want to end the tunnels. They want to end the rocket fire from Gaza. I think on the Palestinian side, it's a lot more complicated because you have President Abbas that now, the difference between now and 2012 is now President Abbas and the PA is part of this equation. And so the question is, what is the room for diplomacy on this? How do you empower President Abbas and delegitimize Hamas, especially when President Abbas seems to kind of be he's playing a double game, in my opinion. He uses his weakness as a strength, saying, I'm the head of this Palestinian government, I represent all Palestinians, and he has that responsibility, but no accountability to really affect any change on the ground in terms of the conflict with Israel.
Well, there are elements that are problematic in the situation. Obviously, when you have over 1,000 people killed just on the Palestinian side and about 40 on the Israeli side, so there is a problem. We can see that. And that's why we proposed a ceasefire some time ago. If we look at when we actually proposed that ceasefire, the casualty rates was much, much lower. And if at that time it had come into effect, many innocent people's lives would have been spared. So there's definitely elements that are problematic. Now, what about, on the other hand, what are the opportunities that lend themselves to diplomacy? On the one hand, now for the first time in many years, you have a unified government for all the Palestinians. That's an element that could come in handy in future diplomatic efforts.
How? It's unified in word, but is it unified in deed?
Well, again, I'm talking about opportunities versus challenges. So I'm not saying that there's anything perfect, but at least this is an opportunity. If you want to think about the diplomatic possibilities, this is something that you have to take into account. Hamas do not have a claim to be the government of the Palestinian territories. They don't have that claim anymore. That's a development. It's an important element. Now, there are other elements. There are humanitarian considerations that are important. People in Gaza, they have human rights like everybody else. So there are elements that represent a challenge, but at the same time represent an opportunity. Now, our approach was and will continue to be, the first thing we do is stop the fighting, stop the killing. That's the first thing we do, and then everybody can come over to Cairo, and we'll try to see what we can do to put into place a lasting ceasefire.
Now, as complex as it was when you were the peace envoy, it seems so much more complex now. We seem to be caught in this chicken and egg situation. We can't stop the fighting without addressing the core needs of both sides. And, at the same time, how do you break the logjam and not be doomed to keep repeating this?
Well, we're in a very different place right now. What Mohamed said about a unified Palestinian possibility or opportunity could be something useful if you could bring the PA to Gaza. But the PA has no capacity. President Abbas has no capacity to stop the Hamas from what it's doing. And as long as that's the case, as long as no one can impose on Hamas, it's going to be very difficult to change that equation. So the first place you have to start, you do have to stop the current fighting. The second thing you have to do is realize that the gulf between Israelis and Palestinians today is dramatically worse than when I was negotiating. Then we actually had a perception on each side, even during different periods, where there were certain common stakes. Not today. Today you have, today, look, the conflict's going to produce enormous emotion and anger on each side. And in that environment, the idea that you can go from where you are to a peace agreement is an illusion.
Well, is a two-state solution even viable anymore? You've heard, people are talking about other alternatives. For instance, Israel totally withdrawing from the West Bank, or Palestinians saying, one-state solution, give us Israeli citizenship and full rights.
one of the reasons that the notion of one state is emerging among Palestinians is because there's a fundamental disbelief that two states can ever happen. The problem is both sides share that disbelief. Israelis are convinced that Palestinians are not interested in a two-state outcome. They think when they talk two states, they're talking about a Palestinian state and a binational state. Palestinians look at Israelis and say they're not interested in a two-state outcome. If that was the case, how come they're building in what should be our state? They each fundamentally believe the other is not interested in two states. Your starting point is stop this conflict, stop the bleeding, and then try to begin to address the sources of disbelief. I mean, this has been a mantra of mine for some time. It's made much more, I think at this point, much more necessary because you have such a gulf between the two sides. You know, I was just out there right after the kidnappings of the 3 Israeli kids. And Palestinians were going around holding up 3 fingers as a symbol of success because they saw the kidnapping as a vehicle for maybe they could get prisoners released. The whole Israeli public was galvanized around the kidnapping of these kids in a society where children are sort of cherished and celebrated. If you don't start dealing with questions of that sort, to begin with the idea that now you're going to be able to solve borders and security and refugees in Jerusalem, you know, you got to have a basis for peacemaking. Today we don't have a basis for peacemaking.
What would your basis be?
My basis would be, first, you are going to have to delegitimize Hamas.
How do you do that? You have an interesting idea.
All right, my idea on delegitimizing Hamas, you know, what we've seen with Hamas is very clear. The last couple of years when they would say, oh, there's no materials to do building. Yeah, there are no materials to do building. Hamas was using them all up underground. They basically built underground cities. You know, all the resources, all the cement, all the steel, that's where it was going. Were they even slightly concerned about the Palestinian public in Gaza? No. By the way, if you look at the polling before this conflict began, even after the kidnappings, by the way, Hamas was profoundly unpopular. So anyway, my answer to your question. The way you delegitimize Hamas, when this ends, we should make it clear, we should be prepared to organize the international community behind a Marshall Plan for development within Gaza. But it should be contingent on, in a sense, having the rockets go away, having the tunnels go away.
Can you negotiate that with Hamas, though?
No, delegitimizing is something that is going to take place over time. But you have to basically expose Hamas for who they are. In front of Palestinians, in the immediate aftermath of this conflict, there's going to be anger. But the very polls that produced profound unpopularity of Hamas prior to this conflict, when Palestinians again look at why they're in the situation they're in, they're going to understand Hamas does not offer them a way out. If the international community and Mahmoud Abbas is seen as part of the effort to produce the Marshall Plan and the only ones blocking it are Hamas, then you can at least begin to try to change the context in which things take place.
All right, let's open it up to questions. As always, identify yourself, please. Keep your question to a question, and please keep it short because we have a bunch of questions. We want to get to as many as we can. We're going to go here and then to this gentleman in the back.
Michael Hirschman, Qatar. I can't figure out what exactly is going on. We depend on them, United States. We have a military base there. The Saudis have withdrawn their ambassador.
Qatar, you're saying?
Yeah.
Qatar.
Yes,
Yeah.
Qatar. Saudis have withdrawn their ambassador. UAE has withdrawn their ambassador. They seem to be giving shelter to Muslim Brotherhood as we are depending more and more on them for our advanced military bases. Can you give me an idea of what is their strategy?
You want to take that then?
Yeah, I'm happy to take it. Well, they have, shall we say, a complicated strategy. On the one hand, they've always wanted to punch above their weight, and they use Al Jazeera to create a kind of platform for themselves within the region. They have felt that they could be a kind of bridge between warring factions. But you also had the last emir looked at the Muslim Brotherhood almost in heroic terms, not just to be a bridge between Islamists and non-Islamists, but Qatar was largely supportive, and he, in the person of the emir, was largely supportive of the Muslim Brotherhood. I used to joke that they liked the Muslim Brotherhood everywhere except in Qatar. Mm-hmm. Now, the fact is, they will continue to try to play this kind of a role. The reason you've seen the alienation by the Saudis and by the Emiratis is partly...
And by the Egyptians.
And by the Egyptians, is largely related to the Muslim Brotherhood. Prior to that time, though, was also because in the case of the Saudis and the Emiratis, they looked at Qatar through a lens of deep suspicion over the way their relationship was with Iran. That began to evolve somewhat. They obviously want to have a kind of safety net with us. If you're playing with different parties, you still, at the end of the day, want a kind of an insurance policy. Well, what's your insurance policy? How about having a huge American base? In the end, when you have a huge American base there, we have a pretty large stake in you. So what they really want to do is kind of have a finger in sort of every pot. And that's the way they've managed things to this point. Now, given their wealth, which is quite high, that also gives them, shall we say, a certain capacity to be operating.
Mohamed, why don't you give us the Egyptian perspective?
Well, I find it very difficult to explain what Qatari foreign policy is about. I'd prefer to leave that to the Qataris themselves, I think.
He's really a diplomat.
We'll excuse it from him. Well, what do you think it's about?
Well, I mean, what I think is that there was a point a few years ago when the Muslim Brotherhood was the rising star in the region. If you wanted to bet on the future, it would make sense to bet on the Muslim Brotherhood. I think that has been completely reversed now. And so it is up to countries that made that calculation a few years ago to start revising their calculation. And it takes different countries, different periods of time to do that.
Robert, they haven't exactly, I mean, they seem that they want to get rid of Assad, and that's a very, noble aim, but they haven't exactly been constructive in Syria either.
Frankly, the Qataris have done more to help the armed opposition than anyone, along with the Turks. Well, let me explain. Remember when this started, when the fighting started in late 2011, there was no Islamic State. And there really wasn't even a large al-Qaeda presence at the time. That developed over time. The Qataris were pretty sloppy in terms of who they gave assistance to. They didn't have a good vetting process, and to be honest, they weren't getting any help from anybody else on that. And they did ask, and they just didn't get the help that they asked for. So I think now there's a much greater understanding among the senior Qataris who work at least on Syria that the al-Qaeda and the Islamic State are problems, and even some of the other Islamist groups in Syria also are a problem. And it's very interesting if you look carefully at what the Islamist groups, not the crazies, not the Islamic State, not the al-Qaeda affiliated Nusra, the other Islamists, you'll see them actually walking back their rhetoric. It's been very noticeable what they're putting on YouTube, what they're putting on Twitter about coexistence, about tolerance. We'd like an Islamic State, but we're not going to impose it. And I think the Qataris are weighing in a lot on that. The Qataris certainly weighed in very heavily to get those hardline Islamist groups, not Islamic State, not Nusra, but the other Islamist groups, to accept a Geneva peace process. They wouldn't listen to the Americans, but they did listen to the Qataris.
Geneva's a whole nother panel.
Just note, by the way, the Qataris in Libya were providing arms to the Islamists against our advice and without letting us know.
Okay, we're going to go to this gentleman right here, and then Pam right there.
Tom Korologos from Washington, D.C. Ambassador Tawfik, I understand and I accept you're cracking down on the terrorists that were attacking the police and killing. What was the justification for jailing the 4 Al Jazeera reporters?
Good question.
Well, it's definitely a good question, and President El-Sisi made his own position on this very clearly. He said, if it were up to me, I would have deported them. But since this is an issue that the judiciary is dealing with, then there is a process that these journalists can follow with the judiciary. And I heard yesterday they actually launched their appeal.
Do you think they'll be let go?
Well, I think at least they have to exhaust what the system allows them. It's they have to defend themselves, and we have a system that is slow, but it has been proved to be effective. I mean, just last week, the prime minister under the Muslim Brotherhood, he won his appeal and he was acquitted and released. So it's a process that's independent of the government. The government is not going to try to interfere, and we're going to have to wait and see how this proceeds.
Once it proceeds, if they, there's a lot of sentiment against these people in the country. If the appeal does not work, and given what the president has said, do you think he would intervene and let them go on a humanitarian?
I think that's premature. I think we still have a process to go, and we should follow it.
Okay, sir, and then Pam in the back.
I have a question for Ambassador Ford. Earlier this week, the Department of Defense indicated that there was no valuable intelligence possessed by the Assad government on our dangerous opponents. And then we heard today that the most dangerous thing from the NSA is foreign fighters in Syria. You were asked the question, but you didn't get to it. What about troping to Assad? Is that something that you would consider? Under what circumstances would you consider it? Thank you.
The way out of the Syria mess, and it's a terrible mess now, the way out of the Syria mess is for what's left of the central government in Damascus, and Syria is largely a failed state now, but what's left of the central government in Damascus to rally with the moderates of the armed opposition, including those Islamists I was just talking about who have toned it down, and for the remaining regime forces, largely Alawi, not exclusively, but largely Alawi, and those moderate armed fighters, to rally together to fight the Islamic State. If they don't do that, frankly, I see no end to this, short of some kind of very nasty foreign intervention from some quarter. I don't think that Bashar al-Assad is going to be able to do that rallying of these different elements, both government forces and the moderate armed opposition. I think there will have to be someone else in the chair, and therefore I don't see how helping Assad himself is going to get us to where we need to go. His forces now are falling back. They're not advancing. I really get quite frustrated with the foreign media portrayals of this. Media drop into central Damascus and say it's great, and you could go to Basra and say things in Iraq are great too. There's no particular problem in Basra today, and yet Iraq is in crisis. So I think a different question would be, how do you get to a government that can rally the regime soldiers and the people that are fighting them in the moderate armed opposition? And I've always thought that the way to do that is to get a negotiation between that moderate opposition and the regime. That's what we were trying to do in Geneva. But the regime just laughed it off, completely laughed it off. And so I think there has to be more pressure on the regime to come to the table. If in the end, out of those negotiations, they say, oh, we've decided to accept Bashar al-Assad after all, we got other concessions, I don't think we have to argue with that. But I think that has to be negotiated. Right now, Assad is trying to impose. He held a sham election about a month ago. Has it changed anything on the ground? No.
2 quick points. First, let's just be very clear. As long as Assad is there, he will be the cause that draws these foreign fighters continually into Syria. So the idea that somehow you can fight ISIS and somehow team up with Assad is already a contradiction. Secondly, if and I heard this said by some of the speakers, if you want to draw the moderate Sunnis or the Saudis and others into this, they won't be with us if they think that basically we're partnering with Iran and Iran's Shia militias to subjugate Sunnis. And that's the way they'll read this. So, you know, the key is you have to strengthen the moderate opposition, and you have to weaken Assad. And if you want to have any kind of political settlement, the only possibility of doing that is changing the balance of power on the ground. And we are still way too slow in terms of trying to affect that.
We have time for one more quick one. Pam, one quick one, very quick.
This is for the ambassador, Mr. Ambassador from Egypt. Can you share anything about the role of the Jamal Network in the murder of Ambassador Chris Stevens, and what efforts are being made right now to prosecute within your judicial system? Thank you.
We have had discussions with the relevant U.S. agencies about this topic. Unfortunately, I am not aware of many of the details, so I simply don't know what to share with you. But what I can tell you is that this is an area that is being discussed, certainly, and as you know, the stages of this issue depends upon sensitive information and what evidence can be presented in court and what evidence you have but you still can't present in court.
All right, well, we're out of time. I know we had a lot more questions and we have a lot more issues to discuss, but thank you very much to my panelists, and thank you everybody for sticking around. The fact that, as Margaret and David said, the fact that so many people are here towards the end of the conference on a Saturday afternoon shows how important the chaos in the region is, and thanks for listening.